in the Atlantic. And then there's 3 time zones in the rest of the country. It's the second largest country in terms of area. It's only second to Russia. Its area is 10 times larger than Colombia's. It has the world's longest coastline, and people may not realize, but there are more than 2 million lakes in Canada, more lakes than all the lakes in the rest of the world combined. Over 7% of the country is covered by freshwater, thanks to our long winters. So as you can see on the map, Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories. At the top, there's the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and the latest creation, Nunavut. So in 1867, that's when Canada was born, over 150 years ago, the 3 provinces of British North America united to form the country of Canada in a federation. And the 3 provinces were New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the province of Canada, which included Upper Canada, which is today Ontario, and Lower Canada, which was Quebec. Over time, other provinces joined the federation. British Columbia, for instance, joined because they were promised a railroad, which they got. And Newfoundland was the last one to join in 1948, following a referendum. Canadian provinces have a great deal of autonomy. They have a lot of rights and constitutional powers, including taxation. The territories, on the other end, are creations of Ottawa, the federal government. Even though they cover 40% of Canada's area, they only have about 3% of Canada's population. In the future, as Ottawa gives the territories more powers, it is possible that at some point in time they may become provinces. British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan used to be part of the Northwest Territories, so things can shift. 80% of Canada's territory is uninhabited. Most Canadians live about 100 kilometers from the US border because of the temperature, the weather. Today, Canada has a population of 38 million. The population is growing faster than most industrialized countries. And based on projections, the population will surpass 50 million by 2070. That's 50 years from now. Colombia's population, just to put it in context, is already 51 million. The median age in Canada is 41.1 years. That means half the population is younger than 41 and the other half is older than 41. The median age in Colombia is 31.3 years, so there's a 10-year difference. Life expectancy in Canada is 81 years and in Colombia it's 77 years. Canada is one of the most highly urbanized countries in the world, with about 82% of the population living in large and medium-sized cities. We have a lot of cities, a lot of nice cities. It is also one of the world's most ethnically diverse and multicultural nations, the product of large-scale immigration from many, many countries. New immigrants make up over 20% of the current population. That's 1 out of 5 people are new immigrants. So Canada is truly a showcase for multicultural coexistence. On any given day, one can hear many different languages when walking the streets of our cities, especially in a city like Toronto, Canada's largest city, where more than half of the city's population was born outside Canada. That means if you walk the streets of Toronto, 2 out of 1, 1 out of 2, I should say, was not born in Toronto, was born outside of Canada. What characterizes the Canadian Federation is the tensions that exist between the regions, the tensions the regions have with the central government in Ottawa, and also the tensions between French-speaking Quebec and the rest of English-speaking Canada. The most serious political tension occurred in the 1970s and 80s when there was a separatist movement in Quebec The no side in the separation referendum won by less than 1%. In the early 2000s, far-right protest parties in Western Canada came on the scene with strictly regional agendas. The party system fragmented, the Conservative Party was decimated. For a time, the Conservatives only had 2 seats in Parliament. Between 1993 and 2001, Canada had 3 minority governments. The Reform Party was the largest Western protest party. It wanted a renewed federalism, which was understood by some as wanting to exclude Quebec from the Canadian Federation. Let's see if I can remove this. Okay. Okay, I removed the slide, Esana. Do you see me now, or I need to press a button to?
I see you on the bottom right corner of my screen, and the slide is in the center.
Stop.
Maybe
share.
try pressing
Got it.
S. Okay,
Got
done.
Got it. Okay. First time I'm doing this on Zoom. It would have been more fun to do it in person. Anyways, I should also like to mention that Canada has its own original sin. By that I mean the situation of our First Nations. It's a real tragedy. It's a real tragedy. You may have heard in the news about the unmarked graves of hundreds of Indigenous children recently found in the yards of Indian residential schools in British Columbia and Saskatchewan. There's new X-ray technology which allows the detection of underground graves, and we expect that thousands of graves will eventually be found in these unmarked graves. So Canadian society is today forced to reckon with the country's past. The Indian residential school system was a network of boarding schools for Indigenous children. Between 1831 and 1996, there were 140 federally run Indian residential schools. Attendance was mandatory from 1894 to 1947. The government separated about 150,000 Indigenous children from their families and forced them to attend the Christian boarding school in an effort to assimilate them into Canadian society. The children were forced to abandon their traditions, cultural practices, and language. The goal was to take the Indian out of the children, as the saying went. The residential school system was just one tool in a broader plan of aggressive assimilation and colonization of the First Nations. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administered by Christian churches, primarily the Catholic Church. Thousands of children died of disease and other causes. The Canadian government has acknowledged that there was physical and sexual abuse in these schools. The last school was closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. But Canada is not the only one to blame. British corporations had interests in timber and other natural resources and drove many Canadian government policies which led to the destruction of indigenous peoples and lifestyles. British money funded much of the early missionary work on the Indian lands. The government recently declared September 30th as a new statutory holiday to commemorate the victims and survivors of Indigenous residential schools. So I have that out of the way. Let me talk about the system of government that we have in Canada. Canada is a constitutional monarchy. Its system of government is parliamentary democracy. Queen Elizabeth II is our head of state. She is represented in Canada by the Governor General. The head of government is the Prime Minister, who today is Justin Trudeau. In 1982, Canada adopted its own constitution and became a completely independent country. Canada is officially bilingual at the federal level. Quebec is officially unilingual French. The Parliament of Canada consists of 3 elements: the Queen, represented by the Governor General, the House of Commons, and the Senate. The House of Commons is the center of political power in Canada. It combines the executive and legislative into one. The party with the most seats in parliament forms the government, and the leader of that party is the prime minister. Unlike in Colombia, there is no separate election to choose the executive, the prime minister, the president. The House of Commons has 338 seats. So any party that wins 170 seats gets the majority and gets to form a majority government. Parliamentary seats are distributed among the provinces in proportion to their population as determined by a population census taken every 10 years. Ontario has 122 seats, Quebec has 77 seats, British Columbia has 47, Alberta has 37, and down it goes to the smallest province, which is Prince Edward Island, which has 4 seats. The territories are entitled to only 1 seat. It doesn't have anything to do with the number of their population. Before the next elections, the House of Commons seats will increase from 338 to 342. Alberta will get 3 more ridings. Ontario and British Columbia will get 1 more, and Quebec will lose 1. So this has everything to do with population. So the way things work, legislation is introduced by the government in the House of Commons, where it is debated and approved. Majority governments, of course, can pass any legislation they want and are sometimes referred to as cabinet dictatorship because they can present it and vote and get the majority votes. Most Canadians believe that minority governments are better governments as they force the prime minister and his cabinet to seek compromise and to be more accountable. Daily, there's a 45-minute question period in Parliament where opposition members ask questions to the Prime Minister and the ministers. The questions are provided to the government a day in advance. The debates are very lively and often very rancorous. Ministerial responsibility is the backbone of the parliamentary system, which means government ministers are responsible not only for their own actions, but also for those of their department. It ensures the accountability of the government to the legislature and thence to the Canadian public. The Senate is the upper house of Parliament. It has 105 appointed, not elected members. They are appointed by the Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister. Senators have a lifetime appointment, but they have to retire at 75. The role of senators is to represent regional interests and provide a sober second look at proposed legislation before they are passed into law. But since senators are not elected, they do not have the legitimacy to overrule the House of Commons and the decisions that they take. The Senate can also propose legislation, but not financial ones like taxation or appropriation. Most of the proposals come from the House of Commons. Most Canadians think that the Senate does not serve a useful function. They feel that the money spent on the Senate can have better use somewhere else. Let's try the screen again. Okay. Canada's electoral system is known as the first past the post. This term comes from horse racing, as you can see on the image. It means the winner takes all, irrespective of the margin. So this guy wins the riding, he becomes the member of parliament for the riding. It doesn't matter the margin between him and the others. There are only a few countries which use the first past the post voting system. Among them are the UK and the US, but majority do not use this system. As I said, the candidate with the most votes in the riding wins a seat and goes to the House of Commons. It does not matter the margin of victory, and that is the issue with the Canadian electoral system. The party comes to power because it has more seats in parliament and not because it received more popular votes across the country. Again, this is an area of contention. The number of seats a party has in parliament is not proportional to the percentage of overall votes it receives across Canada. And with the arrival of third parties, we normally see more than 2 candidates in each riding. The votes, because of that, the votes are split between several candidates, and we often end up with close 3-way races and even close 4-way races. Winning candidates in a riding sometimes receive about 30% of the total vote, or even less. The problem with this system, the winner-takes-all system, is the support the losing candidates receive in a riding is completely vanished. It can be significant, but it's not really recognized. So, unless the government in power has a majority at the national level, but only has a minority, it leaves the impression that the election outcome is distorted and the government in power has a false majority. Okay. Well, elections are all about population density. Ridings are distributed among the provinces in proportion to their population, as determined by population census taken every 10 years. Since Canada's birth in 1867, Ontario has been the most populous province in Canada. It has more than 14 million inhabitants, representing almost 40% of Canada's population. Quebec has 8 million people. British Columbia has 4.5 million. Alberta has 4 million. Manitoba has just over 1 million. Saskatchewan has 1 million. Nova Scotia has 700,000. Newfoundland and Labrador has 500,000. And PEI, the smallest province, has about 150,000 inhabitants. The territories have about 50,000 inhabitants. The city of Toronto in Ontario has a population of 3 million. The area, the suburbs surrounding Toronto are known as the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. And they have a population of about 7 million. Now, the Golden Horseshoe, what we call the Golden Horseshoe, which goes from east of Toronto all the way down to Hamilton, Niagara Falls, all the way to the New York state border. We call it the Golden Horseshoe for a good reason, because it looks like a horseshoe. They have 9 million people. So 1/4 of Canada's population lives in the Golden Horseshoe area. So of course, that's a big power block for elections. So this area is Canada's most important economic engine. It generates 2/3 of Ontario's and 1/4 of Canada's gross domestic product. It is one of North America's fastest growing regions. The region has several economic clusters like financial services, information technology, telecommunications, automotive, biomedical, biotechnology, aerospace, and food and beverage industries. So this region attracts 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 new immigrants arriving in Canada. Usually in Canada, every year, 200 immigrants arrive. This year, because of the COVID backlog, 400,000 immigrants are expected to land. And just think, 2 or maybe 1 out of every 2 or 1 out of every 3 will settle in this area. Historically, New York City had been the biggest magnet for immigrants, but after 9/11, more immigrants settled in the Toronto area than in the New York City area. So with that in mind, it's not surprising to say that in 20 years, the Golden Horseshoe is forecast to have a population of 14 million. So we'll have 14 million people living in this area. So Canada's last election in September, yes. On August 15th, Prime Minister Trudeau called an election. Yeah. The election call was a surprise because his minority government had 3 years left in its 5-year mandate. Many people were upset over the call for an election in the middle of a pandemic, and just as the nice summer weather was coming to a close. The Canadian Constitution does not address the date of elections, but pegs the term of parliament, be it federal or provincial, to a maximum of 5 years. Prime ministers have no term limits. The prime minister and his cabinet have the authority to govern as long as they have the confidence of the majority of the House of Commons. A government can stay in office for up to 5 years, as long as it does not lose an important vote in parliament. The prime minister must call an election if a parliament is no longer functioning despite all attempts. He or she can also call an election whenever he or she feels it's strategically beneficial for the government to continue in power. And that's what Trudeau was doing with this call. But Trudeau had a working coalition with the New Democratic Party, the NDP. He had handled the pandemic well, vaccinations were on track. His government had given out a lot of stimulus money. There were no major disagreements among the coalition partners over the decisions his government was taking in dealing with the pandemic. There were no scandals in government. Equally important, the opposition had not forced the election through a vote of non-confidence in parliament. In other words, there was no reason to call an election with 3 years left in the mandate. But since Trudeau was doing very well in the polls, he had every expectation to form a majority government, which would make governing easier. So 5 parties participated in the elections. The Liberals, the center to center left Liberal Party, the center right to right wing Conservative Party, these are the 2 major parties, the center left Quebec centric Bloc Québécois, which came on the scene in 1991. The Bloc's efforts are exclusively geared towards Quebec nationalism and for the benefit of a sovereign Quebec. It's kind of strange to have a party like that in a federal parliament, but that's the way it is. Then we have the center left to left wing New Democratic Party, which came on the scene in 1961. The Green Party, which is exclusively concerned about protecting the environment. And the new kid on the block, the People's Party of Canada, the PPC. Their political position is right to far right wing. Their ideology is Canadian nationalism, libertarianism, and right-wing populism. I'll talk more about them in a few minutes. By law, Canadian campaigns last a minimum of 36 days and a maximum of 50 days, which is more or less 5 weeks. Compare this with, well, this campaign lasted 37 days. In Colombia, campaigns last about 6 months. In the US, presidential elections, campaigns can last about 20 months. So, unlike in Colombia, where campaigns are about slogans which have absolutely no political content, Canadian campaigns are all about ideas and policy proposals. The media encourage us to study the different platforms before we vote. And once a party forms the government, we consider their campaign promises not as empty slogans, but as good as a contract, as good as a written contract. Unfortunately, in this election, there wasn't a single big new idea. The election was truly unnecessary. Okay. Just give me a minute. Let's get all the... Okay. Sorry about that. So this is the way the country looked in 2019, the previous election. These were the results. The red are the liberals. The blue are the conservatives.
The map of Baruch.
You don't see the map?
We don't see the election maps. We just see the previous one of Toronto.
Oh, okay. Let me see. This is an important map. I want to share it with you. Try again. You don't see the, you see, this is
See
the
the previous
Toronto
one.
map.
That's strange.
Okay. No?
Now we see it.
Okay.
Yeah, there it
If I
is.
can just get rid of this. Okay. Okay. So the red, they're the liberals. The blue, the dark blue, that's the conservatives. The yellow, that's the NDP, the New Democratic Party. The light blue, that's the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. The green, they only had very few seats in British Columbia. You see it in the corner here. So in this election, the Liberals had 157 seats. 170 is the cutoff to be a majority. So they had to form a coalition government with the NDP. And I want to go to the next. Bear with me. Okay, now we're in business. Okay, now this is the 2019 results. And this is what we got with this election 6 weeks ago. Not much of a difference. It's basically the same. There's just some minor changes, but essentially it's the same. And this translated to 159 liberal seats, 119 conservative, 33 bloc, 25 NDP, and the Green, they had two seats.
So parties are very regional, Varouj, like in the States.
Well, you're going to find out the conservatives, I'm coming to that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a blue wall in Alberta and Saskatchewan where the conservatives win with very large margins, and they almost resemble a regional party because they're not winning anywhere else. So in 2021, the Liberals basically won 2 more seats. From 157, they went to 159. Trudeau fell short of his 170 majority, and again, he had to form a minority government with the NDP. Conservatives got, as you see, 119, and there it went. So after spending $650 million on the elections, all the Liberals got was to be in power in a minority coalition for 4 to 5 more years and 2 more seats. Nothing else changed. And Canadians are justifiably questioning the Prime Minister's ability to call an early snap election. This election has been called the most pointless election in Canadian history, since never has so little changed after an election. Anyways, the results show that Canadians were not in any mood for change, and they were happy with the minority government, which is what they got. And historically in Canada, minority governments are more productive. Okay.
So an example would be, when you say they're more productive, an example would be the party of Trudeau's father, for example.
Or even now, what happens is Trudeau has basically, he can't lose a vote of no confidence in Parliament, so he needs to work with the NDP, so he needs to compromise. As I say, majority governments resemble a dictatorship. You know, they can bring the legislation, pass the legislation, there's now nobody to stop them. But a minority situation, they're cognizant of the fact that their minority coalition partner can pull the pin anytime. So we see this. I personally am happy to see minority governments. Majorities are like bulldozers. They can do anything they want. It's easier for them to govern. But I think for the governed, we're happy to see a minority because you know that they're compromising, they're discussing, and they just can't do whatever they want to do.
So minorities would tend to shift towards the center left, center right? Is
Well,
that what makes them?
both the liberals and the NDP are center left. NDP is more to the left. So I think Canada is basically majority left, but center left. I mean, no, nothing too radical. So, you know, the thing with this election was the pundits, the media, they were predicting that these would be actually very close elections because there had been a large number of mail-in ballots because of the pandemic. And everybody was convinced that on the night of the election, they won't be able to declare a winner because the election would be so close that they had to wait for the mail-in ballots, thousands of mail-in ballots to be counted, and it would take a few days for us to find out who the winner was. Anyway, so the polls closed east to west. That's the way it goes. That's the time zones. So they closed in Newfoundland first. Half an hour later, they started counting in the maritime provinces. An hour later, it was the turn for central Canada, which is Quebec and Ontario. Well, the Bloc, which, as I said, is Quebec-centric. I mean, their only focus is Quebec. They won most of the seats in Quebec. And curiously, the Bloc was not doing very well until during the English language leaders debate, when an Anglophone journalist asked the leader of the Bloc Québécois about the perceived xenophobic law in Quebec. And I'll talk more about the law in question. Mr. Blanchet, the leader of the Bloc Québécois, responded quite aggressively to the journalist and basically said, that's a matter for Quebec to decide the laws that we want to enact. The other leaders let the question slide. They didn't respond until the next day when they realized they had made a mistake by not responding to the journalist in a fairly aggressive way. And the next day they made declarations saying, yeah, no, nobody can interfere in Quebec's right to pass laws that they want to pass. Because of that little incident, Bloc Québécois' popularity went up 10 to 12%, and at the expense of the Liberals, because Trudeau was doing quite well in Quebec, but because of that incident, the Bloc made the comeback. Because, for the first time in a long time, the Bloc wasn't doing well. But just a small incident like that changed everything. Okay, let me talk now about the nation of Quebec. Quebec is a lovely province, beautiful people, beautiful province. It is the only French-speaking society in North America, and it does see itself as a nation. French is the only official language in Quebec. The province has strong laws that protect the French language and culture. Quebecers feel that without protection, French language and culture would disappear in North America. The Quebec government has recently introduced a new language bill, Bill 96, which will make French even more prominent in Quebec by reducing services available to the Anglophone community, to the English community. The bill redefines who is an Anglophone in Quebec and eligible for English services, including attending English schools. Of course, when this happens, the Anglophone community, which is a minority in Quebec, they feel threatened. They feel that the new language law is just going to be more onerous on them. The message is newcomers going to Quebec will no longer have a choice to go into the English stream. Like their children will have to go to French school, and it makes it even more tight. Constitutionally, the bill can be challenged in court because it does discriminate. But Quebec has made the preemptive use of the Constitution's override clause to suspend fundamental rights. This is known as a notwithstanding clause. Some provinces signed the Canadian Constitution only because there was a notwithstanding clause included, something that would not be used all the time. But in this case, Quebec announced that they will be using the notwithstanding clause, which means there cannot be a constitutional challenge. The other law in Quebec, which is very interesting, is the secularism law, Bill 21. This law prevents public service workers like teachers, judges, police officers, and other professionals from wearing religious symbols on the job. So people working in the public service cannot wear items like the hijab, the turbans, the Jewish yarmulke, and crucifixes in the course of their duties. All the new hires in Quebec's public sector are affected by this law. Current employees wearing religious symbols are allowed to keep wearing them, but they will lose that protection if they get promoted or change jobs. So civil rights groups and opposition politicians have pointed out that while the bill theoretically treats all religious symbols equally, they say the largest pool of people who will be affected are non-Christian women who wear scarves or veils. They see the law as having a distinctly xenophobic and sexist edge. I don't know. It affects every religious group equally, but the point they're making is that it affects non-Christian women proportionally more. The Premier of Quebec recently was quoted as saying, "It is important before deciding to come to Quebec that if you expect to be in a job, in a position of authority, you will not have a right to wear a religious sign." Quebec is a very progressive province. So this is a very interesting, and this was the question that was asked by the Anglophone journalist during the English language debate, where Mr. Blanchet basically attacked the journalist for asking the question. He said, "You are looking for the answer that's already in the question," that sort of thing. Anyways, that gave him a boost. Let me try this again. Okay, we come back to the Golden Horseshoe. In Ontario, the Conservatives won seats across rural areas, like you see it in the blue, but lost in the cities of Ottawa. It's not on the map, but it's further up. In Windsor, which is to the west, right on the border with Detroit. London, which is a little bit to the west, and Kingston, the old capital of Canada. And most importantly, they basically lost the Golden Horseshoe. The NDP picked up a couple of seats here, but it's all red, as you can see. As the votes were being counted in the Golden Horseshoe area, and before the voting had stopped in the West, just like 2019 and many past elections, the media projected that the Liberals would form the next government. Minutes later, they projected that it would be a Liberal minority government. It came very quickly. Nobody was expecting this. It's obvious that in Canada, election victories depend on which way the Golden Horseshoe voters decide to go because of the large population. Counting comes from the east to the west, but by the time it hits the Golden Horseshoe, we know who's going to win. Now, this is what happened. The Liberals did not get most of the votes, but they got most of the seats. The Conservatives got most of the popular votes, but they got fewer seats. Bloc Québécois, this is the NDP, they got quite a bit of popular votes, but not enough seats. And this is the People's Party of Canada. This is only their second election. They got 5–6% of the vote, but they did not win any seats. For decades, the Conservative Party has not done well in the Golden Horseshoe. But in 2011, under Stephen Harper, the Conservatives won a majority government, making significant breakthroughs in the Golden Horseshoe. They even won several seats right in Toronto and managed to turn the map we just saw mostly blue. This
And-
time around, the
Excuse me,
conservative-
Farouz, sorry, I think there are a few people who are trying to enter and you are
Okay.
the host. I don't know if you see them trying to enter there.
I'll pay attention, Esana, but
Okay.
let's see. Where would I see them? At this moment, nobody's trying to enter.
Nobody is? Okay, okay. I just
Nobody's,
thought.
but I'll start paying attention.
Okay,
Okay. What happens is in the prairies and in the West, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, the conservatives win with large margins, like 80, 90% of the vote. But the liberals win more seats with very small margins. So that explains why the popular vote does this trick, you know, where the conservatives get more and the liberals get less. Anybody trying to come in, Esana, that you can see?
no, can you make me co-host again? And I'll take care of that. Yeah.
Okay. Just give me.
Go to
give
my
me-
name. Just click over it.
Okay. Click over it and
Yeah, you can make me the co-host, co-anfitrión.
make co-host. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
There you go.
Okay,
That wasn't hard. Okay.
okay. Good. Now, are you okay? Yeah, that should work now.
Okay, this is what happens in Saskatchewan, Alberta, parts of British Columbia, and parts of Manitoba. That's what we call the blue wall. It's all conservative with very, very, very large margins.
How does conservative in Canada compare to the Republican in the States?
You know, the conservatives for a while were calling themselves the progressive conservatives. And we had back in the 70s and 80s, what we called the red Tories, which was basically Tories who were progressive. But what happens is let me see if I can come back here. Okay, do you see me, Asana?
I see your graph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
What happens is the Conservative Party has been grooming their followers to move further and further to the right. And because of that, they're losing relevance in Canada, because Canada is basically a liberal center-left country, except the blue wall in the West. And when we'll see, when the leader of the Conservatives, Erin O'Toole, tried to sound moderate in order to win this election, he came across as very insincere. Like, I'll get into that in a few minutes, but the Conservative Party, if they don't moderate their base, their conservative social base, the chances are they're never going to win the election. They're number one, they're not very immigrant friendly. So Canada, 1 in 5 is new immigrants. And the rest are all families of immigrants. And so then they need to make up their mind. As they stand now, they sound like a regional Western party. If they can't break the Golden Horseshoe, they're never going. I mean, Stephen Harper was able to do that in 2011, and he even got a majority. Now,
He was the Conservative Party.
Conservative Party, and he stayed in power for a long time until people got tired of him. But everybody else is trying to sound moderate, but people just see that as something not sincere. The blue wall, the previous map that I showed you, is a symptom of Western alienation. Alienation is the feeling in Western Canada that they are ignored. Alberta and Saskatchewan are the most right-wing regions in Canada. They feel that they have little or no representation in the laws and policies of the federal government when the Liberals are in power. This is a real problem. This time around, the Liberals won 2 seats in Calgary, Alberta. So at least this time around, and they selected one of them to be a cabinet minister. So at this time around, they will have a Western Canadian representative in the cabinet. This feeling of Western alienation has intensified in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And after this last election, they may even feel less connected to the rest of the country. I mean, the elections were won before they had finished voting. So, I mean, that sort of thing obviously doesn't go well. Fortunately, this sentiment of alienation is not very widespread. It's basically in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Otherwise, it would be very bad for national security.
So this is like the US Midwest, so to speak.
But they articulate alienation, and there are some small parties which even call for separation, which isn't realistic, but the fact that they're talking about that, because Quebec was talking separatism in the 70s, 80s, now they talk about autonomy. They don't talk separatism, but Western Canada is kind of upset. And a thorn on the side of the Albertans is what we call equalization payments. This is something that's mandated by the Constitution, where Ottawa takes money from the rich provinces and gives it to the poor provinces. In our lexicon, we call it the have provinces and the have not provinces. Alberta has a lot of oil wealth, and for the longest while, they've been a have province. Quebec, on the other hand, receives over half of the equalization payments in the system. There's a very complicated way to calculate these payments. And the thing with these payments is there are no strings attached. Like, you don't have to spend it on health, you don't have to spend it on bridges. The government, federal government, dishes out that kind of money, but for equalization payments, it's just billions of dollars to whatever you want to do. Of course, Alberta's wealth comes from the oil and gas, which is not in vogue these days. Like, nobody is actually pushing too much for oil and gas. The premier of Quebec is often talking against the oil and gas industry of Alberta. He calls it dirty energy, and he says there's no social acceptability to build any additional pipelines, which is a big issue. So on October 18th, just a couple of weeks ago, Alberta had a non-binding referendum on the question of removing equalization payments from the Constitution. In other words, they're saying, we're fed up giving money to this, especially if Quebec is getting some of this money and they're against our oil pipelines and that sort of thing. We want out of it. Well, 61.7% of Albertans voted yes to remove the federal equalization program from the Constitution. But of course, nothing is going to change. But Premier Kenney of Alberta said that a yes vote would give him leverage as he tries to gain national support for a constitutional amendment, which is a very complicated process. So for the time being, nothing is going to change, but the message is very clear. Strangely, I think we all know that the future of global oil and gas sector is not very bright. Alberta's tar sands are vast oil fields which produce very heavy oil, which is difficult to extract, very expensive to extract, and it leaves behind very toxic waste. The tar sands have been described as one of the world's biggest carbon bombs. Tar sands may not have a very bright future. Maybe this isn't a good time for Alberta to think of pulling out of the equalization payments. You don't know what the future holds. The province of Newfoundland was for decades a have-not province. They were getting money. But then they discovered offshore oil. They became a have province, so they started contributing to the equalization program. I think now they have fallen back to becoming a have not. But, you know, with the question of pipelines, Joe Biden canceled the pipeline that was going to run from Alberta to the States. There's always all kinds of indigenous protests whenever new pipelines are being built from Alberta to BC. There's all kinds of litigations and that sort of thing. So who knows where the world will be in about 10 or 20 years as far as oil is concerned. But in any event, for now, Alberta is saying, we don't want to share our wealth through the equalization program. Okay, returning to your question, Esana. The current leader of the Conservative Party is Erin O'Toole. He is the third Conservative leader to lose to Trudeau. Stephen Harper won, but he lost to Trudeau. Andrew Scheer was another one who lost. And now, a few weeks ago, Mr. O'Toole lost. O'Toole figured that his two predecessors had been too far right-wing. That's why they lost. So he tried to show himself as not being a right-wing extremist, to be a moderate. He spoke about inclusiveness, diversity, being forward-looking and being worker-friendly. He repeatedly said, we're not your dad's Conservative Party anymore. So he tried his best to come across as a moderate. He even took many similar or even identical positions as Trudeau, which had never been part of the Conservative platform. He declared himself to be firmly pro-choice, very unusual. He promised billions of new stimulus spending for the post-COVID recovery. He promised increased funding for the public health system. These are things that the Conservatives never do. He promised there would be no budget cuts for government programs. He even promised to increase immigration in spite of the fact that Conservatives have a love-hate feelings about immigrants, even though everybody understands that Canada's prosperity and tax base depend in large measure on the contribution of immigrants. Even on the question of Alberta's future oil production, Otoole imitated Trudeau. Trudeau had promised to phase out the oil sands in Alberta and had declared several times that he would stand up to the oil companies. Of course, when Trudeau says these things, he says it in French, en français. He doesn't say these things in English. So when Otoole switched his support to the pro-carbon tax, that was something remarkable because, I mean, Alberta is saying one thing, Otoole is saying something else. Because the carbon tax is one of the core grievances against the current federal government in Alberta. The Conservatives have been saying for years that the carbon tax is horrible. It's a stupid idea. And then suddenly Otoole says he supports it. So Otoole tried to sound more reasonable than, well, he sounded more reasonable than some past leaders of the Conservative Party, but at the end of the day, he had a hard time to sound sincere. When a conservative runs as a progressive, it invites skepticism and scrutiny. And I think Otoole was exposed as a phony because he made such a big switch and he lost. Then there was COVID. Otoole had been backing Alberta's conservative government, the provincial government, who were taking hands-off position on COVID, which was basically wishful thinking. No masks, no vaccine mandates, no lockdowns. Alberta even opened everything back to normal on July the 1st. Almost immediately, 100% of the COVID cases in Alberta and Saskatchewan hospitals were the unvaccinated people. The two provinces' healthcare systems were completely overwhelmed. Just a week before the election, Alberta's Premier Kenney had to backtrack and apologize to Albertans for his mishandling of COVID. So Otoole lost even more credibility because he had backed a bad idea in Alberta. So in a desperate move, he started attacking Trudeau personally. And the Canadians, we don't like to see politicians stoop that low, you know. Liberals closed their campaigns zeroing on Otoole's residual right-wing views to show that the conservatives were not progressive. They criticized Otoole's opposition to mandatory COVID vaccination for workers and travelers because, typical conservative, he considered a mandate of that type as an infringement on personal choice. The Liberals labeled Otoole as being pro-gun because Otoole had opposed Trudeau's expansion of the list of prohibited assault firearms. So these elections show that even a progressive conservative leader who tries to be progressive is not enough to appease Canada's left. And by left, I mean center left mostly.
It also seems like, Varouche, that there's a move. One of the issues in this election was that there was a move away from a party-based parliamentarian type of election, where Otoole drifts away from a party line and it's him, similar to a Republican type of system.
But you know, Otoole is going to be punished. I'm sure he'll be replaced before the next elections or when the Conservatives have a leadership review, because he showed or pretended to show that he was too moderate. The social conservative base of the Conservative Party don't even believe in climate change. They don't think it's real. And they will not tolerate Otoole's moderation. So it's going to be interesting what the future holds for the Conservatives. As they stand now, they're a regional party in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But that's far from being a national party. Does that answer your question, Isana?
Yes, it seems another issue is language, historically in Canada, which has kind of been the basis of partisan politics with Quebec, and even now, going back to the issue of English in the central part of Canada.
Yeah, I think it's a fact that Quebec is unilingual French. I mean, they had legislation which made that, and now they've introduced new legislation which would solidify that. And I think most Canadians have learned to accept that. And there's nothing that can be done. Quebec has decided that they need to protect their language and culture, and they're protected. But some people say, like, you're depriving my children from going to an English school and learning English. So there is also that kind of thinking going on, because when you force people to send their children to French school, in today's world, maybe learning English is not a bad thing to do, right? But so there's that tension. And as I said, in Canada, there are tensions between the provinces and Ottawa, among the provinces, and English Canada and Quebec. There are tensions. And I think Canada will survive. I mean, Canada is known to make compromises every step of the way, and they will make compromises. But there are tensions. That's why politics in Canada is not boring. It's actually quite interesting. Let me talk about the other parties, the NDP. Their leader, Jagmeet Singh, during the campaign, he stuck to his left-wing positions, but he also had a novel strategy. He wanted to win over the young voters. So he appeared on TikTok and YouTube, dancing Bollywood style with his wife, trying to energize a group, the young people, which in the best of times does not participate in politics. So that didn't work. Also, Trudeau had legalized marijuana. And for all intents and purposes, he had the young people in his corner. I mean, today there are legal cannabis stores everywhere in Canada. They even provide home delivery service. So anyways, the NDP didn't really make any headway with the young people. They won more seats and they went up a little bit in the popular vote, but this was Singh's second election loss. He too will be replaced probably. The Bloc, we already spoke about them. They got 7.6% of the vote, all of it in Quebec, and they got 33 seats. The Bloc obtained half the votes of the NDP, but they got double the seats of the NDP in Parliament. So again, It's one of those peculiarities which needs to be corrected somehow, no? The Green Party collapsed because they were busy infighting and they had financial difficulties. They ran few candidates. Their leader was unpopular and not very well known. Their vote went down from 6.5% to 2.3%. They only won 2 seats, one in Victoria, BC, British Columbia, and the other one in Guelph, Ontario, where the Liberal candidate resigned mid-election because of a sex scandal. So the Liberals gave their votes to the Green candidate, not to the Conservative. The new kid on the block, as I said, was the Popular Party of Canada. And this also touches on your question, Isana. This is a right-wing populist party which sought to capitalize on Otoole's move to the center. So as Otoole was moving to the center, the PPC was gaining supporters. Because there will always be frustration among conservatives when their party moves to the center and fails to represent them. That's when new right-wing parties come on the scene, and the PPC is one of them. As I said, their ideology is Canadian nationalism, libertarianism, and right-wing populism. Their political position is ultra right-wing. Their supporters, the PPC supporters, were very vocal and aggressive, and they were very opposed to COVID safety measures like masks, lockdown, and vaccines. They were very active online and on the streets. They heckled Trudeau at campaign bus stops, even throwing pebbles at him. This kind of behavior is very unusual in Canada. Election campaigns in Canada are very cordial. We don't have extreme political divisiveness. But COVID was not their only reason to exist. Many of the conservative base voted for the PPC because their platform included axing any funding for multiculturalism, significantly reducing the number of immigrants and refugees entering Canada, abandoning work on climate change and carbon taxes, and removing lockdowns and vaccination passports. So this is basically the Trump play in Canada. White supremacist groups encourage their followers to support the PPC. We do have white supremacist groups in Canada, not many, but they came out and said you have to support the PPC. Some polls had the PPC at 10% support because they thought that the depth of the backlash to COVID restrictions was very high. It turned out not to be the case. Still, the PPC tripled its popular vote in only its second election. They increased their vote total from 300,000 in 2019 to over 800,000 a few weeks ago. That's up from 1.6% to 5% of the popular vote. And the votes were not just in Alberta and Saskatchewan, they were broadly spread across the country. But spread across the country in areas where the right wing is actually quite powerful or present. In rural areas, they competed with the Conservatives and came in second. Some analysts say that the PPC may have cost the Conservatives up to 24 seats in close ridings, as most PPC voters would have voted for the Conservatives if they had not existed. So they were victims. The PPC was a victim of the first past the post system. They failed to come anywhere close to winning a seat. Even their party leader didn't win a seat, but they did get 800,000 votes, about 5% of the population, of the voters. It will be interesting to see if the PPC will survive once the pandemic is over. It's possible that they may lose the wind in their sail and disappear. I think most PPC voters are waiting to see if the Conservative Party will return to the right from the center in time for the next election. Now, when the Green Party won 5% of the vote, the media in Canada started considering the Greens as a major party. They were inviting them to leaders' debates and that sort of thing. It will be interesting to see if they'll do the same with the PPC. Any questions? We'll move to the electoral reforms, which is the purpose of this presentation. But let me see if I can bring up a slide.
Does anybody meanwhile have any questions?
Okay, we'll have some at the end, I'm sure. The share of popular vote for the governing party has been consistently going down. It now stands at 32.6%, which means the Liberals won 32.6% in the last election and they formed the government. But since 1900, you can see there's all the share for the governing party has been going down. So if we measure popularity of a sitting prime minister by the overall popular votes his party has received, then you see that Justin Trudeau is the least popular prime minister. So this was Paul Martin had this, and it's been going down. It's been going down. Trudeau had 33.1 in the last election. Before that, he had a majority, but in 2019, he had a minority. And now, in a sense, if you look at it this way, he's not popular. Maybe he should not be the prime minister. In a democracy, everyone gets a vote, and every vote is supposed to be equal. One person, one vote. But in the Canadian context, it's difficult to say that the votes in the West, which have little or no impact on the final outcome of a federal election, have the same weight as the votes in the Golden Horseshoe. Well, no electoral system is perfect. There is no one-size-fits-all electoral system. Every country uses a modified electoral system. The most commonly used system in the world is what's called the proportional representational electoral system. That's what we have in Colombia. The voters use a preferential ballot to select more than one candidate and rank their choice in a sequence. The number of total votes a party receives in closely proportional is proportional to the number of seats it gets in Parliament or Congress. This. Okay. Reform advocates in Canada call for a move to a proportional electoral system, where the proportion of votes a party receives corresponds more closely to the seats a party has in Parliament. The majority of full democracies use a pure proportional representation or a mixed proportional system. Germany, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Norway, New Zealand, Ireland, many countries. There are two types of proportional representation lists, the open list and the closed list. With the open list, voters are able to choose which specific candidate they prefer. Their vote counts as both a vote for a candidate and for the party he or she represents. When the votes are counted, the candidates of the party with the most votes are elected to Parliament or Congress, and the parties also receive a proportional share of seats based on their share of the vote, the party vote. In a closed list proportional system, the parties supply a ranked list of candidates before the election. Voters only choose the party and not the individual candidate. In Germany and New Zealand, they have a mixed member proportional representation system with elements of the current first past the post system and the proportional representation system. The voters get two ballots, one for their local representative and for the single seat riding, and one for the party. In the current debate on electoral reform in Canada, no advocacy group is suggesting that Canada adopt a closed list system. There are different ways of implementing a rank preferential ballot. One way is in each riding, the last position is dropped and the corresponding votes are redistributed in order to ensure that the eventual winner in the riding has a majority, not just a plurality. of the voters in the riding. Another idea that I find attractive is to get rid of riding boundaries and amalgamate several ridings into one. For example, in the west end of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, there are 11 ridings. Because of the proximity one to the other, they will have similar concerns and issues. Those 11 ridings can be made into one riding, and by using a ranked ballot, 11 members of parliament can be elected. So that's another way to expand and just make the significant gains of other parties also count for something. Because as it is now, in those 11 ridings in West Toronto, they all went Liberal. But if you get rid of the boundaries, make them into one because they have similar concerns, then you could have maybe 5 Liberals, 4 Conservatives, 2 NDP, whatever. So that's, to me, that's a simple way of doing it. It kind of makes sense. The problem with the Canadian system is that it just keeps producing election results completely at odds with the wider popular vote. There seems to be a disconnect between the popular vote and makeup of the parliament. Actually, there is a disconnect. And as we spoke earlier, the system declares the winner when people in the West are still voting. There's no easy solution for this because of the time zone and Southern Ontario's demographic power. I mean, so many people live in Southern Ontario that they will always carry the weight. Most Canadians would agree that the electoral system needs reform to improve the quality of the results. Reform advocates point out that the reason people are not more engaged in elections is because they feel their vote does not count. The average voter turnout for Canada's federal elections since 1867 has been 70.5%. That number is steadily dropping. Today, it stands at around 60%. In provincial elections, the turnout is lower. And in municipal elections, it's even lower. It goes down to 10 or 15%. That's unfortunate because the actions of municipal governments have the most impact on our lives. And few people come out to vote in municipal elections. In the FPTP system, the first past the post system, there are in safe ridings where people know that the result is a foregone conclusion, people simply don't come out to vote. Why waste my vote on a party that cannot win since the winner takes all, they ask. Or they point out that many people don't vote for the party of their choice if they are afraid of splitting the vote. So instead of voting for the party people prefer, they may vote for a party they may not like in order to prevent the party that they don't really like from getting in. This is called strategic voting. A lot of the votes cast in Canada are strategic votings. For example, if I want to vote for the NDP, but see that the Liberals are in a tight race with the Conservatives, and the Conservatives are moving ahead of the Liberals, I might decide to vote Liberal instead of NDP. So that's called strategic voting. It doesn't reflect my wish, but it's strategic because I want to prevent the Conservatives from winning. So I switch my vote from the NDP to the Liberals. Many attempts have been made in Canada to reform the electoral system to be more proportional. They have not succeeded. The last attempt was at the provincial level in British Columbia in 2005 and 2009. British Columbia is a fairly progressive province. It's not part of the Blue Wall, even though the eastern part of British Columbia does go with the Liberals. The last referendum they had 2 questions. Should we keep the first past the post system or not? And if not, what kind of a PR proportional system should we introduce? Well, let me go to the first referendum in 2005. In 2005, 57% of the voters wanted to get rid of the first past the post system, but the number of voters who took part in the referendum did not meet the 60% threshold, so the referendum failed. In the 2009 referendum, which asked the two questions, 61% favored keeping the first past the post system. So you see that contradictory results in two similar referenda, which is a manifestation that there is no consensus on electoral reform, even though there are polls that showed that 77% of Canadians want to move toward the system of proportional representation. Now, during the 2015 federal elections, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party campaigned on the promise that 2015 would be the last federal election under the first past the post electoral system. They stated that a Liberal government would form an all-party parliamentary committee and introduce legislation within 18 months to enact electoral reform. Many people voted Liberal because of that promise, and the Liberals won a majority. Sure enough, on December 1st, 2016, the Parliamentary Special Committee on Electoral Reform released its report recommending Canada to hold a referendum to adopt a proportional representation voting system for federal elections. After the Brexit fiasco, referendum has become a dirty word for most governments. Governments are not too keen on holding referendums. So a few months later, Trudeau's Liberal government announced that it was no longer pursuing electoral reform. So they broke a promise. Now, to refresh your memory about a bit of Colombian history, President Pastrana in 1998, just like Trudeau, promised electoral reform. He also promised to hold a referendum on the question. Polls at the time in Colombia showed that 80% supported Pastrana's referendum. But once he took office, Pastrana backpedaled on his campaign promise of holding a referendum. He realized, like Trudeau, that an electoral reform could favor the non-traditional small political forces and make governing difficult. Nothing came of that. But let me see if I can play you a very short video so we can hear Mr. Trudeau explain to us why he did what he did. Okay. Let me just quickly go to this. This is, if the 2015 elections were held under the proportional representative system, how would things have looked? Well, the Liberals, who had the majority, they would have lost the majority. The Conservatives would have gone up a little bit more. The NDP would have gone up really a lot. The Bloc Québécois would have gone. So the small parties or the smaller parties do much better under the PR system. No wonder the Liberals aren't interested to bring in reform. Look at the drop that they took here. Very significant drop. Bear with me. I'm going to try and play a video.
I believe there is consensus on electoral reform.
Ms. Anna, you see the video or not yet?
I could hear it, but I can't see it. What I see
Okay,
now
well,
is the graph.
I'll try something else. Resume share, okay. No?
Yes, yes.
My question isn't specifically, I believe there is consensus on electoral reform. but my question isn't specifically about that. I ran in the election of 2011, and as you know, that involves a lot of door knocking. One experience that really stuck with me was I spoke to a gentleman who said he does not vote because politicians are all the same. They say exactly what you want to hear during the election campaign, and then they just turn things around and do whatever is convenient for them. So my question to you is, what do you say to people who don't vote, to those who did vote for you based on what you said you were going to do, only to have you turn around and not do what you say you're going to do?
No, great question. And thank you. And it's one that I've obviously been struggling with over the past months. The commitment I made repeatedly and explicitly on electoral reform, I made because it really mattered to me. And it does really matter to me that we improve our democracy. And I know that there are a lot of people out there, actually, the vast majority of Canadians who, yes, want to see us improve our democracy. I also know that it's really important that when it comes to changing our democracy, we do it right. I mean, everyone can see that, moving forward on increasing cybersecurity for our political parties for Elections Canada, yeah, that's something that's important to do, creating more transparency in fundraising, making it easier for people to vote by turning back the Unfair Elections Act. Those are meaningful changes that we know and can be very comfortable are going to leave us better off in the future as a country. Electoral reform, changing the way we vote, is a big change that will and could have far-reaching consequences for our country and needs to be taken very, very seriously. It's more than just who might win a few more seats in the next election. It goes to fundamentally how we operate, how we value, and how we hear diverse voices within our parliament. And for me, and I've been arguing this since long before I became leader, I always felt that we could make a clear improvement to our political process by offering people to not ever have to vote strategically again, to give a preference on your ballot, to rank your ballot. A lot of people don't like it. A lot of people say it favors Liberals. What it does is it favors parties who are good at reaching out to find common ground with broad groups of Canadians, to say, can I be your second choice? That's what it does. I think that's probably a good thing, but I've heard very clearly that people don't think that's a good thing, or that they think it would favor Liberals too much, and therefore I'm not going near it, because I am not going to do something that everyone is convinced is going to favor one party over another. So then we get down to the remaining choices. A referendum, which we've seen recently what happens when referendums go, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the Italian one, whether it's, there is a lot of divisiveness, particularly on an issue that is very important to a small number of people, but not nearly as important as jobs and healthcare and educational opportunities and reconciliation and a whole bunch of other issues to a lot of other Canadians. It's an important one, but it's not the only one. And the danger of a divisive, a division within the country and a campaign that is likely to get a lot of heated rhetoric at a time where we're looking for stability in face of a very unpredictable and unstable political context around the world. I don't think a referendum is the right way to go. And then
Okay. Isana, you guys are there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let me. Okay, I'll stop there, but because I don't know where Trudeau got the idea that the proportional system would help the Liberals. It's the exact contrary. The studies that are out there about the electoral reform show clearly that that system would actually hurt the two big parties, the liberals and the conservatives, and help the smaller parties. So it's either he's seen other reports or he's certainly misleading. So basically what he says in the rest of the video is that any radical reform of the electoral system is not desirable when the current system is perceived to be working well. That the proportional system would create instability because the smaller parties would fragment the legislature, which will result in frequent minority governments and lead to endless elections and unstable governing coalitions. Those who agree with this point of view point to Israel and Italy with their multi-party elections. But if one looks at the vast majority of countries using the PR system, like Germany, New Zealand, Sweden, Denmark, none of them experience chaos. It is true that countries with the PR system, they don't get to see majority governments. They end up nearly always with minority governments and must engage in formal power sharing agreements in order to form a government, because the parties have no choice but to cooperate with one another. In Germany, for instance, after last month's election, they have three parties who need to sit down, agree to form a government. It is true that too many minority governments will bring some level of stability. However, minority parliaments are better able to hold the executive accountable. I mentioned that earlier. And Canada has very positive experiences with minority governments. Minority governments have given us the big ticket items like our national healthcare system, our pension plan. So I don't know why Trudeau would say something like that, that the liberals would benefit. If we look at the last election 6 weeks ago, where the liberals had 32.6% of the votes and they got 159 seats. Under the PR system, they would only get 109 seats. That's a huge loss of 50 seats. And we saw in the 2015 election, they would have taken a 45 seat loss and not formed the majority government. In this case, Trudeau would have had to form a minority government still, but he would have lost 50 seats, 159 down to 109. The NDP had 17.8% of the popular vote and they had 25 seats. They would have gone up to 65 seats if it was the PR system. That's a jump of 40 seats. That's another reason why the liberals and conservatives would be against reform. Bloc Québécois, they had 7.6% and 33 seats. Under the PR system, they would have only 24 seats. So they would have lost 9 seats, which would have pushed them out of the 3rd place in parliament to 4th place. The PPC had 5% and no seats. Under the PR system, they would have had 21 seats. This is a really, really good reason why the conservatives would be against reform. They would lose so much to the PPC. The Greens had 2.3% and 2 seats. Under the PR system, that would have given them 11 seats, not 2, which is what they got. So I'm going to start closing my presentation, and hopefully there will be some questions. So unless there is a major scandal or disagreement with the NDP, Trudeau will be the prime minister at least until 2025 for a total of 10 years, because he first came into power in 2015. The question, will Canada one day have a proportional representative system? That's the question. I think proponents of the status quo in Canada say the first past the post system is working as it should. The system has served Canada for well over 150 years. It's not broken. There's nothing to fix. They say, look at Canada. It's in the top 10 countries measured by GDP. per capita GDP is more than 42,000 US dollars. Just to put it in context, Colombia's GDP in 2020 was about $5,000, which is 8 times smaller than Canada's. It does not appear likely that we'll see electoral reform unless Canadians are prepared to take a leap of faith and leave behind the system which they think has worked for them for 150 years, and it has worked. So the leap of faith is we find that in religion, where just you don't know what's out there, but take a leap of faith and believe that everything is going to work out well. Legal experts point out that federal electoral reform may require constitutional amendments, which is a very difficult process. Fine-tuning the electoral system is easy. That can be done through legislation. Like a few years ago, robocalls was a big problem in Canada because people were getting these calls with misleading information. So the Canada Elections Act was amended to make them illegal. Or lately, fear of outside foreign government influence is a concern in Canada and elsewhere. So the Stephen Harper government prohibited expats such as myself, who have been outside of Canada for more than 5 years, to vote. Why? Because there's hundreds of thousands of Chinese or Hong Kong citizens who are also dual Canadian citizens. The fear was somehow the Chinese government might interfere with these people to influence the Canadian election results. And that's a valid step that they took. But to change the entire electoral system, it's next to impossible, because the liberals and the conservatives would have the most to lose. There is also apathy when it comes to this question, because the debates on electoral reform, they never reach a high level and they never gain momentum. Yeah, there are polls which show that people would like to see that, but we never actually come to that point. And just lastly, any electoral reform in Canada will have to deal with the complex question of the Senate, what to do with the Senate. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled that to alter the Senate in any way, a constitutional amendment is required, which would need agreement from the House of Commons, the Senate, and 7 or more of the provinces representing at least 50% of Canada's population. I will stop here for any questions. I hope you found this informative.
Indeed, it's very informative and thoroughly researched. They also go to show that each country's, I always say countries are like patients. They all have a background. They all have their traditions, good or bad. And it seems like it's also important in terms of identity to maintain the political culture, because it's something that's kind of inherent and part of the culture, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but you know, the fact is most full democracies are not using the first past the post system. They're using representational. I think it's going to be very difficult to change Canada's system, because people are saying, yeah, you know, it has served us well for 150 years. Right. Look where we are. But it wouldn't be a bad thing to have some sort of representational component in the Canadian electoral system. Yeah, there is some risk, because the PPC could become maybe a fairly major player, you know, if they start winning seats in the parliament, like the Bloc Québécois. So it will be disruptive, but I think maybe at the end, it doesn't sound very democratic, where the governing party doesn't get the majority of the votes. They get a third of the vote, and then they form the government. So that's the question.
There's a question from Juan Ronderos.
This one.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very informative. It was very, very thorough. But I have a question regarding the writings, and that is that I always thought that that the ridings was a very good system because it was, you know, it would represent a group of people, and you had more ridings in places that had more people. Like in Toronto, you have many ridings because there's many people, and so I was always under the impression that you know, that would help to have one person, one vote system. So why I'm baffled up at the idea of like, how can you have a reality of winning the popular vote and not winning seats, when actually the ridings that have, you know, a lot of people are the ones that are putting the seats.
Juan Gabriel, there was one seat, I think, in Quebec where the Liberals won with 12 votes. The losers were the Bloc Québécois. So, I mean, they won the riding, but what happens to the other votes, you know? And like they may have won it with only 30% of the riding votes. So, yeah, Toronto has 55 ridings. Obviously, they will have many more ridings than anywhere else in Canada, because the population is there. As I said, there's going to be like 14 million people living in the Golden Horseshoe. But the example I suggested, maybe I said, you know, in the west end of Toronto, 11 ridings. They all must have the same concern, traffic, this and that, because they're in close proximity. How about if we just make that into one and then implement a ranked system? So maybe other people who have scored, who've voted and lost, they also get people elected. I think somehow we need to find a system, maybe not altering the whole system, because I don't think the Liberals and the Conservatives will agree to that, but maybe tinkering with it and just making a bigger riding and then implementing a ranked system. So not just 11 first past the post winners, but 11 MPs will come out of the 11 ridings made into one. And some of them will not be Liberals. There will be Conservatives and NDPers. And so it's a tough question. Yeah, demographic might is important, but within that, there needs to be, it needs to reflect, the parliament needs to reflect all these other people who voted for somebody else, but the Liberals, even in the Toronto area. Because Liberals win with very small margins, because there are 3-4 parties in the riding competing, and what happens is the vote is split, and first past the post, the Liberals come ahead with narrow margins. So, but what happens to the others? The other 60-70% of the votes, they disappear. They don't show anywhere in the parliament.
And just a quick follow-up on that one is that the other thing is that once you know, somebody's elected on a riding, they get to parliament, and not necessarily are they going to follow through on whatever promises they made, because once they get to the parliament, they need to, you know, vote with the rank, and that's the other thing that always intrigued me about the parliamentary system, where yes, they would vote on a riding, they will vote on local issues, on representing, and whoever you vote for is supposed to be representing that community. But once they get to parliament, then all votes are voted based on their party. And so that there's kind of a dichotomy there that it's intriguing to me.
Yeah, but you know what happens, Juan Gabriel? When we vote in Canada, the name of the candidate is not on the ballot. It's just the name of the party, Liberal, Conservative. Years ago, we had the Rhinoceros Party, which made fun of the whole system, but there's no name. There's no name attached to in the ballot. It just, we're voting for the party. The party has selected the candidate and will make that person a member of parliament. But we're voting for the party. And when they go in, they need to behave according to the wishes of the party. They can't become independent unless they went in as independent. But 99% of the, MPs are attached to a party. It's the party that rules in Canada. And the party system is very strong, unlike in Colombia, for example, where the party system really doesn't exist. It's the individuals who go out there and make their own campaign and make their own deals, and they make their own promises. You know, you vote for me, get me votes, I'll give you contracts. Well, that does not happen in Canada. The party rules. Even at the ballot box, we're voting for the party, not the individual.
Thanks. Thank you.
That's kind of what Otoole has begun to change.
The only thing is, Anna, he won't last. I think the next leadership review, he'll be
By his own party.
By his own party, yeah, because
Yeah.
he went, even though, in my opinion, he wasn't sincere, but he did move too far to the center. I mean, it almost sounded ridiculous when he actually sided with Trudeau against Alberta's oil and gas.
Mhm.
I mean, that's where his support base is. And he's saying, you know, I believe in carbon tax. No, Alberta does not believe in the carbon tax.
Yeah. Any other questions? This has been really very interesting. It's unfortunate that it's the end of the semester, but I'm sure many students will find the recording very interesting. And I think it will also be on YouTube with the other webinars that we've had over the semester. So I'm sure it's going to go to good use. And hopefully we can organize similar types of forums about Canada and maybe Canada's international cooperation with Colombia and some of the other issues that you've worked with. And we've also mentioned your book as a future conference topic as well.
Well, Sana, anything to do with Canada, you can count on me. Canada is a passion. Canada is exciting. Canada is not a boring place. There's a lot of things happening there, a lot of good things. And as I said, there is tension. Absolutely, there's a lot of tension. But at the end of the day, Canadians compromise, and we know how to get along together well. We were upset when the PPC followers started throwing pebbles at Trudeau. Totally unacceptable. We don't do that sort of thing. So we'll see what happens. Anyways, anything Canada, count me in. And
Thank
we
you
can
very
discuss.
much.
Okay.
It's a great pleasure to have you, Baruch.
Okay, Sana.
Thanks
See you soon.
for attending. Take
COVID
care.
over. We should get together soon.
We will, definitely.
Okay, Sana.
Goodbye, and thanks
Take care.
to all of you for joining.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Goodbye.